They had always said that blood is thicker than water, and for most of their lives that adage had felt like an anchor, a promise that through petty quarrels, through late-night fights over money or the color of the curtains, the family would hold. But promises have a way of unspooling quietly, the knot loosening not with a single dramatic snap, but with countless small abrasions until what once secured you slips away. The estate, the rambling, sunlit house on the corner of Sycamore and Dale, the land with apple trees that had been bulldozed down to two stubborn trunks, the attic filled with trunks of yellowing photographs and the smell of cedar, became, after their father's sudden and politely ordinary heart attack, the wedge that split them. On paper, the will was simple, an attestation of a life lived mostly by the same rhythm. Wake, work, wife, children, occasional fishing with a friend, small acts of stubborn decency. He loved the house, he loved their mother, and he wanted them to have what he had left. He had left. But legal clarity does not equal emotional appeasement. The true inheritance, as everyone soon discovered, was not bricks and acreage but memories layered like wallpaper, peeling, stained, and sometimes hiding things you wished you hadn't seen. The eldest, Miriam, had always been practical, the one who paid the bills, who kept records in neat stacks, and who, after their father's funeral, sat across from the lawyer and said the words everyone was thinking, "Oh, we should sell." She imagined the money steadier than the house, clean numbers, savings, a way to settle debt, and perhaps by smaller, easier things that demanded less love and more sense. Her hands trembled when she said it, not entirely from grief, but because she felt in that moment both empowered and horribly alone. The second Jonah had spent his life trying to prove he was not the baby of the family any longer than he could avoid. He had taken care of the yard, driven their father to his appointments, and sometimes cooked a meal that tasted of regret and apology. He listened to the recording of the will on loop in his head, and heard instead the small silences between clauses, the things left unsaid. Where had their father's full affection stood when the years piled up and the bills stacked higher than conversations? The youngest, Lila, the one who left in her 20s with a backpack and a theater degree, and returned only during holidays and funerals, insisted the house was an anchor that kept them tethered to who they were. She imagined the attic with its permanent dust motes and the porch where their father had taught them to carve initials into wood as a stage for new stories, plays and dinners and noise and the comforts of a place that refused to become anonymous. What none of them admitted, and what the will could not legislate, was how much each of them had been starving for recognition, for the subtle, private approval a parent gives without deliberation. In the months that followed, the house became its own courtroom. Meetings that had once taken place across a chipped kitchen table over coffee and toast now happened under the fluorescent neutrality of a lawyer's office and the very language of family. Remember when, you always, that's not fair, transformed into inventories, appraisals, tax implications. Miriam argued that selling would honor their father's care by relieving future burdens. Jonah argued for maintenance and for the intangible worth of continuity. Lila argued for preservation and memory. They studied spreadsheets with the same intensity their father had used to study fishing maps. They fought about whether to keep the oak dining table that had splayed with use, whether to sell grandmother's locket, whether it was fair that their mother, who had not legally fought for a portion of their ownership, would nevertheless remain in a house no single sibling consented to keep. Their mother, Ruth, sat between them like an old oak with roots that had been chewed by termites. She had loved hard enough to believe that love could smooth edges. She had loved in ways that left no receipts. She leaned on habits, church on Sundays, a careful hand over tea bags, the ritual of folding napkins, because habits remember for you when grief makes memory unreliable. When Miriam, who had always been the most adept at articulating logistics, insisted they list the house on the market, Ruth's face folded like an old map, and she confessed in a small voice that their father had once whispered, late one night, that he had wanted the house to remain a place where their voices could come back. He wanted the door open, she said. Oh, that's what he said. Words like that should have sealed matters, but promises whispered in the dark have a different legal weight than signatures on paper. What followed was not a single explosive argument, but months of erosion. Jonah's resentment that Miriam had spoken to the realtor first. Lila's quiet, almost theatrical, refusal to pack anything at all because each object was an island of memory. Neighbors who started to call with their own opinions as if the house were a community garden and not the site of a family's undoing. The community loved the house. The house had hosted graduations and funerals, dances that staggered into dawn, mattresses dragged onto the lawn during summer storms. Selling it felt to some like erasing a communal archive. For Miriam, the sale was also a ledger that balanced a life where she had been practical out of survival. She remembered nights when she had paid for groceries and felt both pride and a hollow ache, as if her caretaking was an account that could never be fully credited. For Jonah, it was humiliation. He had learned in his father's company how to mend a fence and how to hold a stubborn foot in a splint. To sell the house felt like admitting failure to the father who had expected him to stay. For Lila, it was betrayal, a denial of all the small rebellions of youth that had found their way back home in the end. So they rehearsed grievances through phone calls that looped and repeated, through family gatherings where the arguments smoldered under polite laughter. They tried to arbitrate with lists, who had put in more at what time, who had been there when the roof leaked, who ate more of mother's stew. But life, they were discovering, was not an accountant's ledger. It was memory, which accumulates unevenly and refuses tidy distribution. The lawyer's office produced a mediator who suggested options: buyouts, shared trusteeship, phased sales. The mediator spoke with the measured cadence of someone trained to believe that complexity can be parceled into contracts. The siblings tried in fits and starts to use the mediator as a buffer, as if bringing another voice into the room could substitute for the absent father's hand on the table. It helped for a while until a dusty photograph slipped from an attic trunk during an inventory and landed, face up, at Jonah's feet, an image of their father laughing with a woman Jonah had never seen, a woman with eyes like their mother's and a smile that seemed to pull something tidy apart. Jonah's discovery became the live wire that set new sparks flying. He presented it like evidence at a trial and asked aloud, for the first time in years, whether their father had been living a life of private duplicity. The photo did not prove anything concrete. It proved instead that people are larger and more contradictory than the tidy roles we assign them. But the moment it was held up, its ambiguity became poison. Miriam accused Jonah of manufacturing drama. Lila accused Miriam of trying to control the narrative. Ruth, her calm dissolving, told them in a voice that trembled like a violin string that their father loved them and loved imperfectly, in the ways of men who cannot make themselves small enough to be. Only one thing. The arguments moved from legalities to moralities. Friends chose sides the way a town chooses a football team. In the grocery store line, someone would lower their voice and ask, have you heard? As if they were discussing soap opera characters rather than people who had, a week before, shared coffee and their father's honeyed biscuits. Rumor stitched new wounds, and the family, exhausted by internal argument, found their private history reduced to public entertainment. Nights became sharp. Miriam would lie awake calculating numbers and imagining a life where her siblings were less angry and perhaps where she had made different choices that would have prevented this. So Jonah slept on a mattress in the garage, furious at the sense that practical work and emotional labor were consistently undervalued. Lila wandered the house like a ghost, touching the frames of photographs, whispering names into rooms as if holy incantations might tie the loose edges of their lives back together. Sometimes in the low hours they each returned to memories that had nothing to do with money, their father teaching them to listen for the first cry of spring, the way he cupped a mug between both hands as if to savor the warmth more slowly than the drink warranted. These recollections were private islands of tenderness that the dispute could not fully reach. But they were islands that could also isolate, because each sibling prized a different recollection as the truest. The dispute, hungry as it was, fed on these differing truths. Legal fees grew like a bad fungus. The joint ownership they tried to impose was inefficient and slow. The house began to age in ways that were more than just physical. Mice found unoccupied corners because no one was in the house at night except the occasional grandson who came to water the plants. The community watched, some with sympathy, some with schadenfreude, and the air around the family became a measured distance. Time, that peculiar agent that sometimes heals and sometimes hardens, did not offer them clarity, but offered instead a series of small moments where they could choose differently and failed. There were attempts awkward dinners where they tried to act as if nothing were wrong, curated visits that seemed designed to satisfy legal requirements rather than emotional ones. At one such dinner, Ruth stood in the doorway holding a casserole and said, simply, he wanted laughter in this house. For a brief hour, laughter did come, not through erasing the dispute, but by acknowledging the absurdity of human beings who loved and harmed in equal measure. But the respite was brief. A neighbor who had always treated their father like a confidant mentioned offhandedly that their father had once talked about leaving something to the town, an endowment or a community fund. "Wit seems a shame," the neighbor said, "if it just disappears into sale." That comment reopened everything, not because it was true, but because it suggested that the father had been a different man in different rooms. In the face of so many small fractures, each sibling clung to an identity that comforted them. Miriam to her prudence, Jonah to his labor, Lila to her fidelity to memory. Their identities became armor as much as they were grief. The legal process crawled forward and sometimes withered. Appraisals came back and were higher than expected. Buyers made offers and withdrew after hearings of family drama leaked into the listing. The house transformed from a home into a kind of public exhibit where strangers would come to look, whisper, and then decide whether to claim that particular architecture of sorrow for themselves. Through all this, the mother remained a quiet axis. People assumed she would break, that she would finally speak, align with one child, or worse, be exploited. Instead, she surprised them by being small and immovable. Not pious exactly, but present. She began gradually to write notes to each child, letters that were plain in their grammar, but volcanic in their tenderness. She would tuck these notes inside drawers and in hat boxes, and sometimes hand them across to Miriam or Jonah or Lila in the middle of a crisp afternoon. "Remember," she would say, "that grief is a garden that needs tending. It does not grow if you burn it all away." The notes were not a solution. They were an invitation to remember differently. The siblings read them at first with irritation, then with a dawning recognition that their mother was attempting to be a quieter kind of lawyer, arguing not for division but for retention of the less tangible estate, stories, private language, shared jokes that the world could not appraise. One day, in a moment that had nothing to do with legalities, Jonah found himself on the porch with a cup of coffee and his father's old radio. A song, cheap tinny, earnest came on the air, one their father used to hum while he repaired a leak. Jonah, who had been hammering and fixing as if the house could be mended by his hands alone, realized he had been trying to fix the wrong thing. He thought about how their father and his flaws had provided each of them a version of himself. The practical Miriam, the working Jonah, the free Lila. The realization did not dissolve the disputes, but it did change Jonah's posture around them. He began to visit Ruth more often, not to negotiate but to sit in silence and scrub the same cups he had scrubbed as a child. In those small rituals, some of the heat of argument cooled into the steady domestic flame of ordinary care. Miriam, who had been the most implacable in her sense of duty to what felt like fairness, also changed in small increments. She found one of their father's old notebooks, pages filled with grocery lists, crude sketches of a dock, and the occasional small prayer. Between the lines, she saw a man who loved the precise things of life because he feared their slipping away. She recognized her own hand in his habit of organizing the world. It did not absolve him of infidelity or of whatever private compromises he had made, but it humanized him. She wrote him a letter, something she had never believed a practical person should do, and in the letter she confessed to being tired and to being afraid of loneliness. Lila, who had loved the house as a theater for possibility, accepted that memory itself was not always benevolent. She found in a shoebox a note from their father to a woman whose name she did not know. The note was clumsy and awkwardly affectionate. Instead of brandishing it like a weapon, she burned it in the fireplace and watched the edges curl into smoke. The fire consumed paper, but could not undo the ache. Instavitriu perpetuo. Gradually, these small acts built something like a truce. Not a reconciliation in the fairy tale sense. There were still unpaid legal bills, still quarrels at town meetings, but a recognition that the inheritance they grieved was not merely real estate, but a complicated constellation of love, secrecy, disappointment, and care. They decided in a moment that felt at once arbitrary and inevitable to restore the house to a hybrid existence. Keep the porch in 2 rooms for Ruth, partition off 2 rooms for Lila when she came home to visit, and sell a section of the land that had become overgrown. They would set up a small fund, contributed to buy the sale, that would maintain the property and cover taxes, and they would rotate responsibilities like a household chore chart rather than a courtroom schedule. It was not the solution everyone initially wanted. It was a compromise that acknowledged imperfection. The community breathed a collective, suspicious relief. The house, which had been specter and prize, became again a place where tea steamed and where children drew in the dirt. There were awkward moments. Miriam caught Jonah in the garage one night, both of them wiping away tears from a place that had nothing to do with the sale, and moments of grace, like when Lila organized an evening where the siblings read aloud from old letters and laughed until their throats hurt. They argued still, of course. Old grievances do not vanish because of logistical agreements, but the tenor had shifted from battleground to neighborhood. They learned to speak with the careful precision of people who had watched legal language separate them. Over time, the inheritance they had thought could be measured in dollars and deeds revealed itself more clearly as the slow work of keeping each other present. It required them to show up on days that mattered and days that didn't, to perform small mercies like mowing a lawn or fixing a gutter, to admit mistakes in conversations that were sometimes raw and sometimes funny. The story did not end with a perfect reunion or a final understanding of their father's heart. There were evenings when the past surged like a tide and knocked over dishes of patience. There were anniversaries when they felt the old resentment rising like guilt. But when they looked back years later, what they remembered most vividly were not the legal filings, but the way their mother would stand in the doorway when the family arrived for Sunday supper, hands dusted with flour and eyes crinkled with a kind of tired gratitude. They remembered how, in the end, the inheritance had taught them to distinguish between what could be divided and what could only be tended. A shared history, an accumulation of small kindnesses, and the stubborn insistence that even flawed love can be cultivated into something that keeps the light on in a house where laughter still comes sometimes, messy and human, like the best parts of a life lived together